Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie Council. And Nick, I've been thinking a lot about electricity lately because it's getting warmer. I'm looking at the switch to air conditioning. I forgot my charger the other day and my phone died, right? It's all around us. And I wanted to look at the infrastructure and what it means. And I was been doing a lot of reading, and Bloomberg estimates demand for electricity globally will increase by 60%. Uh, International interconnections are on the rise. There's more and more being built. And in areas, more and more of electricity being used as a tool for geopolitical reasons. And I thought we need to talk about that. We need to talk about this new term, electricity foreign policy. And I met at an NYU event a couple weeks ago, Chiara Lo Prete, and I invited her to come on and speak with us about this very important topic that needs to get some more attention. Chiara is the Associate Professor of Energy Economics in the John and Willie Leon Family Department of Energy and Mineral Engineering at the Pennsylvania State University, and a faculty member in the Inter-College Graduate Degree Program in Energy, Environmental, and Food Economies at Penn State. And she is the perfect person to explain what is going on globally, what is going on with Russia, what is going on with China, really these big questions that I think we need to address in electricity markets. And she joins us now. Thank you so much for joining us today, Chiara. Nick, I told you I met Chiara at NYU when we had a panel in February on global geopolitics and energy, right before the first anniversary of Russia's second invasion of Ukraine. And I was so impressed with Chiara and her discussion of the geopolitics of electricity. And I thought this would be perfect for our listeners, our audience. And we encourage you to join us on Twitter and share your questions so that we can engage in this discussion, which I think is so interesting in looking at electricity, not just at the doorstep, as this small thing that happens in my house when I turn on the light, but as a global issue that we should be discussing more broadly. And I want to just give an anecdote where, we're all talking about higher electricity prices, right? That's been the problem since last summer. We are talking about green energy and the changes, but it really hit home to me when I was in the theater for a Ukraine fundraising event, and the lights went out. And Zelensky's voice, the president of Ukraine's voice, came on and said, "You're in the dark." And I'm paraphrasing. It was much more eloquent and powerful, but "You're in the dark. This is how we live now." And it got me to thinking, really deeply thinking, how much we rely on electricity every single second of our life. And we need to elevate this conversation. And Chiara, thank you so much for being with us to help us elevate this conversation about electricity and about why we need to look at it on a global scale. That it's not just about oil. It is not just about oil because that's all everybody talks about, right? Even driving in the other day, oh, the price of oil shot up because the supply is going down, and nobody ever talks about electricity this way. Can you tell us why we should, why this needs to be part of our conversation? Why have we traditionally only been focused on oil and gas? And then part two of that, of course, is how electricity grids entail geopolitical risk.
So first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Yes, definitely. Over the past 3 to 4 decades, all studies of the intersection of energy and geopolitics basically centered around fossil fuels, right? And the use of oil and gas exports as a weapon has been investigated. A lot of attention to that. But electricity has not received as much attention as you correctly pointed out, and I think that's due to a number of reasons. First, unlike oil and natural gas, electricity is not a globally traded commodity, right? So were the Strait of Hormuz kind of to be shut down, consumers filling up at the pump in the U.S. would immediately feel the pinch. But there's no analogous situation for electricity, really, right? The second point that is often made is that electricity trading tends to be more reciprocal than trade in oil and gas, because oil and gas flow in one direction from an exporter to an importer, while the trade in electricity between countries flows both ways. And this implies that unlike trade in natural gas, which requires like a fixed transportation infrastructure such as pipelines or LNG terminals, the relationship between sellers and buyers of electricity is really less exclusive, right? Even if, say, an exporter of electricity acquired a dominant position with respect to an importing country, the asymmetry could not easily be used. This is the argument. I'm kind of making the argument why this should not be a problem. But the argument is, yeah, this could not really be easily used as an instrument of geopolitical pressure because countries have a number of options at their disposal, right? They could produce the electricity themselves. They could import electricity from neighboring countries. So in other words, the fact that electricity exporters are part of a very complex web of interdependencies between importers and exporters would tend to curtail the potential to use electricity as a geopolitical weapon. Now, I think that these are good arguments. They're valid points, but I would argue also that if network topology allows a single nation to cut off electricity supplies to another country, then such a cutoff would actually pose risks that are even more serious than a fossil fuel disruption. And this is primarily due to the current inability to store very large amounts of electricity economically. We need to balance electric power systems at all times. And so any power interruption could result, you were just mentioning before, can result in blackouts, right? And failures that cascade across infrastructures and neighboring countries. While, for example, the delay of an oil tanker would not lead to failure of an energy system. So in this sense, I would argue that electricity grids are much more vulnerable to disruptions than the current fossil fuel supply. And so the answer to your question is yes, I definitely think that cross-border interconnections can entail geopolitical risks. And so the potential use of electricity as a weapon deserves a little more, like closer scrutiny than it has received so far.
That's super fascinating. And I'm really fascinated by this term, electricity foreign policy, that I think you're hinting at with this discussion of geopolitics. And I think it's important to understand the idea of grid interconnections across borders, because it's something I don't think the average person thinks about. So you're alluding to the fact that there are these interconnections. Can we talk a little bit more about what that means in practice?
Yeah, so cross-border interconnections are interconnections between different countries that kind of have several, there are several potential geopolitical bottlenecks that can hinder these cross-border grid interconnections. And I want to kind of mention a few and bring some examples of like geopolitical hurdles that hinder these interconnections. So I guess the first point, circling back to what we were discussing. So interconnections may be discouraged if there's fear that this interconnection will create and institutionalize some relationships based on asymmetric dependence, right? Which then can be used by one partner against the other. Now, of course, a certain degree of asymmetry is almost like an inherent feature of any energy trade relations. But as dependency rises, the less dependent party can really extract gains from the dependent party, drawing on the asymmetry. And by gains, I'm referring to, for example, political concessions, trade gains, and there may be other gains. So these gains may be achieved by the partial or complete interruption of electricity flows. And again, an example. An example is cross-border integration of electricity in the Mekong Basin, because it's been argued that further integration in this electricity grid is actually suppressed by the fear that China will attempt to use interconnection as a means to extract political concessions from other partner countries, such as Vietnam and the Philippines, on the disputed offshore energy exploration in the South China Sea. So this is a factor that, again, prevents further integration in that particular regional grid. Another factor is lack of trust, generally due to past unstable and bitter political relations. And the example I want to give here is a study that I was reading a while ago, a very interesting study that was published in Energy Policy a few years back. So between 1991 and 2015, there were 10 attempts made to connect electricity grids between Israel and its neighbors. And in this study, published in Energy Policy, the authors examined several Israeli archives, including documents that present the positions and interests of key actors in the negotiation processes for grid expansion and construction during kind of peace building times. And I'm referring to the Oslo peace process beginning in 1991, but also during periods of political conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And so the paper looks at this evidence and finds that for a number of proposed transmission lines, the perception of this dependence bottleneck and lack of trust led Israel basically to block several grid interconnections, because Israel feared that its electricity imports may be used against it by exporting countries for kind of some sort of coercive foreign policy objectives. But on the other hand, there were other international grid connections in the area that were supported and went on. The grid was actually built when these efforts appeared to lead to peace dividends or to strengthen peace, even when maybe the economic rationale was kind of marginal. So in this cases, the dependency argument, the security economy bottlenecks were kind of superseded, overcome. Another issue that I would point out is the so-called zero-sum considerations. So what is a zero-sum game? So in economics, a zero-sum game is a situation where one actor's gain is equivalent to the loss of another actor. And this brings the collective payoffs to a sum of zero. And zero-sum thinking is very common to the governance of energy resources, because what negotiations basically focus on maintaining existing resource allocation rather than opting for cooperation strategies that will increase the sum of net benefits. So in this case, despite the potential increase in the gains of a country from electricity interconnection, cooperation may actually fail if the other countries perceives these gains as their own losses. And again, I want to bring an example of when this might have happened. And I want to refer to the Desert Tech initiative, which was this idea of producing green electricity in the desert of North Africa and export it to Europe. This is a project that drew a lot of political and economic attention in maybe 2009, 2010. but eventually failed for a number of reasons. We can talk about them more, but one of the key reasons was exactly the zero sum considerations on the European side. Yeah.
That's so fascinating. This idea that we can all be more globally interconnected in electricity, and yet there are these factors that are preventing it. To your point, the zero sum considerations. But going forward, there's still all these initiatives that are happening to try to increase interconnectivity. One of the ones we've talked about is China's Belt and Road Initiative. Electricity and working on the electric grid connections is a huge part of that. People tend to think that it's about roads and it's maybe dams. We hear the dam story because some of the dams are failing, but we don't often talk about the electricity part of it. Can you tell us more about what China's objectives are?
Yeah, so the Belt and Road Initiative is this initiative that was launched in 2013, and just like you said, is kind of based on the idea of building connectivity primarily through the construction of infrastructure. Now, related to this and kind of this realm, another parallel Chinese initiative is this proposal for the creation of a global energy grid. Another project, an idea that was presented, I think, for the first time in around 2015. So what's the plan there? Well, the vision is to connect different regions with high voltage direct current, or HVDC lines, across the world. And this would be done to harness wind from the poles and sun from the deserts, for example. Now, DC technologies offer several technical advantages over the more widely used alternative current lines, or AC lines, because one of the key advantage is the low transmission losses over long distance transmission, again, in comparison to AC lines. And these DC grids are also known as super grids. Oftentimes we hear this term, super grids. So we actually mean these DC grids. So the sound proposed in this GEI may sound unrealistic, but actually is based on realistic technical capabilities and considerations. So from a purely technical point of view, it is actually feasible. But on the other hand, the project is incredibly controversial because it would raise questions over control and distribution of renewable energy sources that have really in the past been the focus of the geopolitics of oil and gas, right? And so the political feasibility to realize the vision is very difficult. There are several geopolitical hurdles, and probably the main one is this risk perception of the dominance of China in strategically important critical infrastructure. So the global grid would kind of imply and entail completely different definition of energy security to be achieved at the global level. But the trust, going back to the trust point we were making earlier, the trust required to achieve the new approach is enormous, right? And energy security remains a national objective. So that's the reason why, even though the initiative might be feasible from a technical standpoint, the geopolitical hurdles and are substantial.
Well, I just wanted to touch on that and this question of trust, which I think is a critical one, because you don't want to be in a situation where your economy is humming along, people have their power, and you're in an integrated network, and then someone pulls a switch in another country, and your power goes off. And so, trusting that these interconnections will be running, and maybe will continue to function even if there are disputes between countries, becomes important. And this, I think, brings us, as China is looking at creating this global energy interconnection, it brings to mind that we already have sort of a test case in Eastern Europe. but from Soviet times, the Soviet bloc, efforts to produce energy integration, and then the assumptions after the collapse of the Soviet Union that energy interdependence among states would produce conditions that would alleviate conflict and so on and so forth. And it seems that some of those assumptions may be questioned ever since the Russians restarted aggressive military operations against Ukraine. But can you talk a bit then about this question of, we've talked a lot about integration, but now as you raise this question of national security, what's happening with disintegration all along the line in Central and East Europe? How are countries, and particularly in the Baltic states, which used to have an integrated electricity network with the rest of the former Soviet Union, and particularly with Russia, how is this process going along of disintegrating or deaggregating these cross-border electrical grids?
Yeah. I think that the history of interconnectivity in Eastern Europe provides a very, very clear example of the importance of geopolitics for electricity. So I'm glad that you're bringing this up. And I want to provide maybe a little bit more context before answering the specific question. So the Baltics joined, first of all, they joined the European Union in 2004, but importantly, their grid is still part of the post-Soviet electricity grid, which is called the Integrated Power System, or IPS. Their grid functions as a ring for Belarus, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And this ring is collectively known, once again, as the Brel ring. Now, the Baltic states are also members. They're already integrated with from a market standpoint with the European part of the European electricity markets, because they're part of Nord Pool, which is the electricity markets in the Scandinavian countries. And they have some electricity interconnections with European countries. Now, the decoupling from IPS and synchronization with Europe's continental grid have been on the agenda for some time now. And they are planned, they're currently foreseen for 2025. The project has received approval from the European Commission, which kind of designated as a project of common interest, which kind of opens the way to the EU's financial assistance to the project. But what are the implications of this desynchronization? So, first of all, there would be some actions that would need to be taken on the European side to take some operational adjustment and further market integration measures, and that's okay. But one of the key points is that desynchronization also forces Russia to incur financial costs to take these operational adjustment measures. And perhaps even more importantly, reduces its sphere of influence and its ability to maintain very lucrative electricity exports to the Baltic states. Another thing to keep in mind is that Russia has historically counted on the Baltic transmission networks to supply Kaliningrad, which is the exclave situated between Poland and Lithuania along the Baltic coast. So now, in the initial stages of this negotiation, Russia tried to persuade the Baltic states and the European Union to kind of stop synchronization. And this was done, for example, with diplomatic means. There were some claims that the Baltic withdrawal would actually disconnect Kaliningrad, which could not function in isolation from the IPS. But Russia did not attempt to deliberately destabilize the Baltic's power grid. What are some of the most recent developments? Where Russia started developing energy infrastructure to prepare for the desynchronization of the Baltic states from the IPS before the states are ready to do so themselves. So while in the early stages of the discussion, the interdependence between power grids constrained Russia's use of electricity as a weapon because that would have endangered Kaliningrad's power grid. The constraint may no longer apply after these infrastructural upgrades we're talking about are completed, because at that point, Russia would be, at least in principle, in a position to threaten to prematurely disconnect the Baltics from Brel, which may result in blackouts and potential repercussions on grid balance and stability in Eastern Europe. So the situation is again in flux. We're waiting to see what happens before 2025, but there are several moving pieces. And again, this is a case in point where we want to say that geopolitics and electricity are not disconnected.
Yeah, and I think, taking us back to the point of Ukraine that I mentioned at the top of the conversation, this is also true in Ukraine and Moldova. And you mentioned 2025. Well, Russia's in a war, right? In a war with Ukraine. Finland just joined NATO. Russia is not happy. And so I'm wondering, what are some ways that these interconnections are really influencing in a way that maybe we're not discussing, right? We're discussing weapons, we're discussing drones, but we're not really discussing the electricity problem in Ukraine and that interconnection. Can you talk us through those interconnections and why we need to factor in that interconnection and that grid in the geopolitical discussion?
Yeah, I think this is a great point, and I want to kind of reference a really good article in Foreign Affairs that I read. I think it was published a few weeks ago about Ukraine's electricity crisis, and I think the author makes this argument that there's not just military battles that are being fought in Ukraine. There's also infrastructure battles, and the infrastructure battles do not receive as much attention, but they are important. And actually, the outcome of the infrastructure battle may affect the outcome of the conflict in general. A key part of what's happening, the kind of crisis in Ukraine from an electricity standpoint is related to these transformers. So let me explain maybe very briefly what these are. So electricity grids are very, very complex machines, probably one of the most complex machines ever devised by humans. And they consist of 5 categories of facilities and equipment. We have the generation plants, then we have the transformers that increase the voltage for transmission from the plant to the transmission line. We have the transmission line themselves that carry current from one place to another. Again, we have transformers that lower voltage at intermediate substations. And finally, distribution networks that bring power to homes and businesses. Now, the Achilles heel of electric grids are these large transformers that raise and lower the voltage of electricity. These are called generally step-up transformers. These devices, they're massive. They weigh hundreds of tons. They must be transported by special rail cars and trucks. And importantly, by necessity, these transformers need to be placed in open spaces to allow the free circulation of air for cooling. So this open air design makes them a prime target for long distance attacks by bombers, missiles, and drones. And this is exactly what has happened in the Ukrainian conflict. These transformers have been a prime target for attacks. Now, the procurement of transformers is now a very urgent priority for Ukraine, but obtaining replacements is not as easy as you might think. In fact, it will be very challenging, not just because there's no funds, because these are expensive devices, but also because these are very hard to transport. They're often custom designed components whose manufacturing is concentrated in just a handful of countries, including China, India, and Japan and South Korea. So I think a key point, again, I would definitely encourage everybody to read the article that I'm referring to, which I really enjoyed as an electricity nerd. But I think that the key point is that the war in Ukraine has exposed several vulnerabilities in the supply chains for these key critical equipments. And so there's really a need to think a little bit about different solutions as stopgap measures in situations like this.
I have to admit, I wasn't even thinking about the equipment angle and the vulnerability of the equipment supply chain. And you mentioned Japan, China, India, South Korea. And China is always this factor, right? On the supply side for the actual grid, or thinking of a global grid for the Belt and Road, and for the actual physical parts. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the US-China relationship, and does electricity factor into that, or bring us home to the US, and how does the US think about electricity? Are we worried here, and should we be more worried?
Okay, so first of all, maybe I want to make a comparison with Europe first.
Yeah.
Right? So in Europe, we talked about the BREL. We talked about the European continental grid, which kind of forms the center within the EU. But in fact, in Europe, there are 5 synchronous areas, including that are, again, synchronous but connected via direct current lines. And the Baltic grid is one of them. Now, in the US, back in the kind of early 2000s, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission promoted the concept of independent system operators, they're called ISOs, and regional transmission organizations. The acronym there is RTOs. So ISOs and RTOs operate the transmission system independently of wholesale market participants in about 2/3 of the country of the U.S. And they kind of foster competition for electricity generation through the creation of energy and ancillary service markets. An important thing to go back to your point, the ISOs and RTOs often, but not always, span various states. And again, to give another example, PJM interconnection, which is the largest electricity market in the world, operates the transmission system in a region that includes all or part of 13 states in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, including Pennsylvania, which is the state where I live, and the District of Columbia. So 13 states plus the District of Columbia. Now, I would argue that, yeah, of course, there's no kind of geopolitical conflict of the type that we've been discussing in the US, but policy choices that are made unilaterally by a state when the state is part of this kind of regional grid, for sure, they affect outcomes in regional markets, such as cross-border. In this case, cross-border would be cross-state electricity flows. And the implication is that there might be distortions in the electricity prices that are set across the network, because clearing occurs at the regional level. But once again, if policies are decided at the state level, there might be an impact. What's an example of this? Well, if we go back a few years, so the prospect of retirement by large baseload generation facilities in induced actions in several states to provide out-of-market compensation to financially distressed generation resources. And some nuclear plants requested and have been awarded subsidies through zero emission credits or similar mechanisms. And so a few years back, there was a lot of discussion about these ZECs and how state subsidies might affect the outcomes of regional markets. So there were a number of initiatives taken at the market level to try and mitigate the impacts of these actions taken at the state level. Another example that I want to make is, but this is, I would argue, maybe a little bit less common. Like in some cases, actions taken by market participants affect electricity flows across ISOs and RTOs. So kind of going up one level, like if we think about the connection between ISOs and RTOs. And again, an example, the circuitous power delivery schedules around the Lake Erie region. Again, we go back to 2008, so about 15 years ago. What happened in that case? Well, I think beginning in spring of 2008, speculation grew that some market participants were increasing their transactions over indirect paths around Lake Erie. And this was done in order to take advantage of the different pricing policies of the 4 RTOs surrounding the lake. So the transactions were scheduled to exit the New York ISO. They were going to Canada, then flowing through the Midwest ISO, and then finally, I think, ending up in PJM, which is again the regional grid operator in Pennsylvania and other states. So there were a number of discrepancies between the scheduled and the actual flows. And these discrepancies caused congestion, transmission congestion, and increased costs, causing market distortions. And eventually, these distortions will be paid. The impact on prices is relevant because it affects prices that we as consumers pay, right? So that's the implication for us. As a result of this situation, the Office of Enforcement of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission initiated an investigation into these suspicious power flows. They eventually concluded that there was no market manipulation involved, and market participants were simply responding to price signals when they were, again, placing these circuitous power delivery schedules. But this is another example of decisions made by market participants that affect cross-border electricity flows.
I think that's a great example. So we not only have to look at policymakers and governments, but we now also have to factor in market participants. And I think that's what makes this such a complex network. But I really appreciate you explaining it to us. I think it's made a big difference in my thinking and hopefully our audience. And before we wrap, you mentioned the foreign policy as a trusted source. And I did signal to you that I wanted to hear some more examples from you of what we should be reading to learn more about electricity markets and the complexity so that we can make more informed decisions and we can ask more of our policymakers to make the best decisions for us at the doorstep. Some suggestions.
So I really like listening to podcasts. And I actually do recommend one of the assignments in my classes always relates to podcasts, and I encourage my students to listen to podcasts and kind of give presentations to the rest of the class and like write little reports or expand on a certain topic. So I have like 3 recommendations for podcasts. The first one is Resources Radio, which is a weekly podcast by Resources for the Future that features several interviews with researchers and experts about energy and climate change. So that's the first recommendation. The second one is a relatively less known podcast that is called How We Survive. This is more like a climate tech podcast. I really enjoyed season 1. I think they have 2 or 3 seasons, so they're relatively new. Season 1 was called White Gold, and it focused on the race to mine lithium. And it was just fascinating. I thought it was really interesting and really well done. So I encourage the audience to check it out. The last one is perhaps this is probably more well known, the Columbia Energy Exchange, which again features conversations with energy and climate leaders, with, I think, from government, business, and academia.
Well, we also love podcasts here at the Doorstep. So thank you for those recommendations. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insight. And I'm so glad we met at NYU. I want to give a shout out to another Doorstep guest that we've had here, Caroline Kassan, who is the connection through which we met on our own networking grid. So thank you so much, Chiara, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.